He was standing on my porch in the November rain, thinner than I remembered, his collar turned up against the cold the way he always did when he forgot to check the weather before leaving the house. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Ethan toddled up behind me and grabbed the back of my jeans, and I watched my husband's face go completely white. He whispered something. I couldn't hear it over the wind. I didn't need to. I stepped back, and I closed the door. Let me go back to the beginning. Because none of this makes sense without it. Daniel and I met at a mutual friend's birthday at a pub in Leslieville, the kind of place with mismatched wooden chairs and local craft beers chalked on a blackboard. I was 31. He was 34. He spilled a pint of ale on my jacket within the first 20 minutes of meeting me and spent the rest of the night apologizing in increasingly creative ways, including offering to mail me a handwritten letter of formal regret on government stationery. He worked for the provincial government as a policy analyst. He was earnest and funny and a little awkward, and I was completely done for. We dated for a year and a half before he proposed in Algonquin Park on a canoe trip we'd been talking about for ages. It rained the entire time. We laughed so hard we nearly tipped the canoe. I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. We got married in September at a small venue in Prince Edward County, about 200 people, my side and his side filling the white wooden chairs in roughly equal numbers. His family came in from Mississauga. His mother, who I'll call my mother-in-law because that's all she ever really was to me, wore a dress that was almost but not quite the same color as mine, which my sister pointed out and I chose not to think about. His sister Leah was my maid of honor, because Daniel asked me to include her and I cared about making him happy. And because at that point I still believed that family was family and that we would all figure out how to love each other over time. I should have paid more attention to the dress. The first 2 years of our marriage were genuinely good. We bought a semi-detached house in the East End of Toronto, in a neighborhood with a real bakery and a library branch and a dog park 2 streets over. Daniel commuted downtown. I worked remotely for a nonprofit consultancy, mostly communications and grant writing. We had routines and inside jokes and a recurring Sunday ritual of making too much food and watching whatever documentary series we were currently working through. We talked about starting a family the way you talk about things when you're happy and you believe there's plenty of time. Leah lived about 20 minutes away in Scarborough. She came over for dinner regularly, more regularly than I would have chosen on my own, but I understood that she and Daniel were close and I tried to be generous about it. She was between jobs for most of that period, doing some freelance social media work, which meant she had flexibility in her schedule and a habit of dropping by without much notice. I tolerated it. I told myself that tolerating things was part of building a family. What I didn't know, and what I understand now, only in hindsight, was that Leah had decided almost from the beginning that I wasn't good enough for her brother. I don't know exactly what the root of it was. Maybe she'd expected to remain the most important woman in his life. Maybe she resented that we'd bought a house and she was renting a 1-bedroom. Maybe she simply didn't like me, and the rest of it grew from there. Whatever the reason, the campaign she ran against me was patient and strategic, and I never saw it coming. I found out I was pregnant on a Tuesday morning in late January. I was 8 days late, and I'd been quietly certain for most of those 8 days, but seeing the 2 lines made it suddenly and overwhelmingly real. I sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time, just holding the test, feeling something enormous and warm moving through my chest. I wanted to tell Daniel that evening, planned the whole thing on my commute from the kitchen to the home office, thought about making his favorite dinner, the lamb stew he'd taught himself from a recipe his dad used to make. I didn't get the chance. He came home that evening with Leah. He'd run into her in the parking garage, he said. She'd been in the neighborhood. She had her coat on and her bag on her shoulder like she was just stopping in for a minute. I put the test in my coat pocket because I'd left it on the kitchen counter, and I didn't want to make the announcement in front of her, not that night, not the way I'd planned it. I started making dinner. The 3 of us sat down. Everything seemed normal. After dinner, while I was loading the dishwasher, I heard Leah's voice change. That particular drop in register that means someone is about to say something they've been waiting to say. I turned around from the sink. She was sitting across the table from Daniel with her phone in her hand, face down. She looked at him with something I can only describe as carefully arranged concern, and she said that she hadn't wanted to do this, that she'd been going back and forth about it for weeks, but that she loved him too much to stay quiet. Then she slid the phone across the table. What I saw, from where I was standing, was a series of screenshots, Text messages, or what looked like text messages, between a contact saved as my name and a man named Marcus, who was a colleague of mine, someone I'd worked with on a project the previous fall. The messages in the screenshots were intimate in a way that made my stomach drop. Not just friendly or flirtatious. Explicit. Unambiguous. I said immediately, loudly, that those were not my messages. That I had never sent anything like that to Marcus or to anyone else. I crossed the kitchen and reached for the phone, and Leah pulled it back and held it against her chest. Daniel looked at me. I had known this man for 4 years. I had watched him give a speech at his best friend's wedding that made everyone cry. I had driven with him through a blizzard on the 401 at 2 in the morning because his father was in the hospital. I thought I knew his face better than I knew my own. He looked at me like I was a stranger. He asked me, very quietly, if I had anything to say. I said yes. I said that those messages were fabricated. I said that anyone with basic editing skills could mock up a screenshot in 20 minutes and that he needed to look at them more carefully, check the metadata, call Marcus himself, do literally anything other than sit there and believe his sister over his wife without a single question. Leah said that I'd always been good at talking my way out of things. Daniel said he needed some air. He put on his coat and he left. The front door closed behind him and it was just me and Leah, in the kitchen, and she looked at me with something that was almost satisfaction, barely covered by a layer of performed sadness, and she said she was sorry it had come to this. I told her to get out of my house. She left. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. Then I called Sophie. Sophie is my best friend from university, one of those friendships that has survived distance and time zones and terrible decisions on both sides. She lived in Halifax by then, working in marine biology research, and she picked up on the second ring even though it was nearly 11 at night. I told her everything in one long unbroken stream. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. When I finished, she said the screenshots were obviously fake. That anyone who'd ever texted me would know my writing style didn't match whatever was in those messages, and that Daniel needed to pull himself together. He came back at midnight. He smelled like he'd been outside for a long time, that particular cold that settles into fabric. He sat down on the couch and I sat across from him and I tried again. I was calm. I was clear. I told him I had never been unfaithful to him, not in thought and not in action, not once in 4 years. I told him his sister had fabricated those screenshots for reasons I didn't fully understand but that he needed to trust me over her. I told him I had something important to tell him that I'd been waiting all day to say. He said he needed time. I didn't tell him about the pregnancy that night. The next 3 days were the worst I can describe. Daniel slept in the spare room. He went to work. He answered my texts in monosyllables. He called Leah twice that I knew of. He did not call Marcus. He did not ask me any follow-up questions. He did not look at the screenshots again with any critical eye. He simply sat inside his belief the way you sit inside a room after someone has told you the ceiling might fall, too afraid to look up and too afraid to move. On the 4th day, I made an appointment with a family lawyer. Not because I'd given up, but because Sophie told me to protect myself, and Sophie has never once given me bad advice. I met with the lawyer, a woman with an office on Bloor Street who had the specific manner of someone who has heard every version of every story. I told her the situation. She advised me to document everything, keep records of all communications, and not to move out of the matrimonial home. She told me that fabricated evidence in the context of a marriage was something courts took seriously and that I had options. I felt, for the first time in 4 days, like I was standing on solid ground. When I got home that evening, Daniel was already there. Leah was with him. This time it wasn't just the two of them. His mother was there as well, sitting at my kitchen table in her coat, her hands folded in front of her. They had clearly been talking before I arrived. The energy in the room had the quality of a decision that had already been made. My mother-in-law spoke first. She said she'd always known something was off about me, that I'd always seemed like someone who kept things hidden, and that she was heartbroken for her son. She said this in a voice entirely devoid of heartbreak, the way people speak when they're performing emotion they don't actually feel. Leah sat beside her brother on the couch with her arms crossed. She looked at me with an expression I've thought about many times since. Not triumph exactly. Something more like relief. Like something she'd been working toward for a long time had finally clicked into place. Daniel told me that given everything, He thought it was best if I found somewhere else to stay while he figured out what he wanted. I said no. I told him this was my home too, that I was on the title and the mortgage, and that I had just spent the afternoon with a lawyer who had advised me exactly on this point. I said I was not going anywhere. There was a silence in the room. Then Leah said, in a voice like she was mentioning something nearly forgotten, that there was one more thing. She said that given the nature of what she'd seen in those messages, and the timing, she thought Daniel deserved to know that the pregnancy might not be his. The room went very still. I hadn't told anyone, except Sophie. Nobody in that house could have known I was pregnant. The only way Leah knew was if she had gone through my things. I thought immediately of the coat. The coat I'd worn the day I found the test, and I felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had gone through my pockets. Daniel looked at me, and whatever small part of him had still been uncertain, still been the man I'd known for 4 years, I watched it close. I watched the door of it shut. He said he thought I should leave. I said, call the police, Daniel. Because your sister just admitted she went through my personal belongings. And the screenshots she showed you are fabricated, and I can prove it, but you have to be willing to look at the evidence instead of just sitting here letting her run this whole thing. He didn't call anyone. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of our bed for a long time. I thought about what I was carrying. About the appointment I hadn't made yet. About Sophie's voice on the phone 3 nights ago, saying obviously those messages aren't real. I thought about the lawyer on Bloor Street who had handed me her card and said call me if anything escalates. I called her. I left a voicemail at 11:30 at night. Then I packed a bag. Not because I was giving up my home, but because I could not be in the same house as those 3 people for another night. I drove to a hotel on Kingston Road that had a decent parking lot and a coffee maker in the room, and I sat at the small desk by the window for most of the night, thinking. In the morning I had a missed call from the lawyer and 2 texts from Daniel asking if I was okay. He did not ask if the baby was his. He did not apologize. He did not say anything about Leah or his mother. Just, are you okay, and we should probably talk. I did not respond. What I did instead, over the following 10 days while I stayed at the hotel, and then in a short-term furnished rental in Riverdale that I found on Kijiji, was build a case. The lawyer helped me understand what I was looking for. I contacted Marcus directly, explained the situation, and he was furious and cooperative in equal measure. He provided me with his actual phone records, which showed no such exchange of messages, ever. A digital forensics consultant, someone the lawyer referred me to, examined the screenshots Leah had shown Daniel and confirmed within 48 hours that the metadata was inconsistent, the font rendering was wrong, and the messages had been created using a third-party app designed to simulate fake text conversations. I filed a police report for fabrication of evidence and harassment. I did not tell Daniel any of this. I had tried telling Daniel the truth 3 times, and each time he had chosen his sister's story over mine. I was done explaining myself to someone who had already decided what he believed. At some point in those 10 days, I realized I was not going back. It was not a dramatic decision. There was no single moment of clarity, no scene where I stood in front of a mirror and made a speech to myself. It was quieter than that. It was waking up at 6 in the morning in the furnished rental with the sound of the street outside and the particular stillness of being completely alone, and understanding that I was okay. That I was going to be okay. That the shape of my future did not have to include people who had looked me in the eye and chosen to believe a lie. I called my mother. She drove up from Kingston the next morning. She sat with me in the small kitchen of the rental and I told her everything, and she cried briefly and then became very practical in the way she always does, which I have always found more comforting than tears. She stayed for a week. When she left, I felt capable of standing on my own. The lawyer filed for divorce on my behalf, uncontested, citing the breakdown of the marriage. I left it with her. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in East York. I had my own income, my own savings, a community in the neighborhood I'd been building for 2 years. I had Sophie on the phone 3 times a week. I had the baby growing, steady and present, a fact that was entirely mine. Ethan was born in September. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. In a birthing suite at the Scarborough Health Network with my mother on one side of me and Sophie, who flew in from Halifax and would hear nothing about it, on the other. He had dark hair and very serious eyes, and he came into the world with an expression that suggested he was already skeptical of most things, which felt appropriate given the circumstances. I did not list Daniel's name on the birth certificate. The lawyer had advised me on this as well. He had made no contact during the pregnancy. He had not attempted to reach me through legal channels. He did not, as far as I knew, know where I was. The divorce was finalized when Ethan was 4 months old. I had signed the papers in the lawyer's office on a Thursday afternoon with a feeling I can only describe as the sensation of a very heavy thing being set down. I walked out onto Bloor Street in the February cold and I called Sophie, and she screamed in celebration loud enough that the woman walking past me on the sidewalk turned to look. The months that followed were not easy, and I want to be honest about that. Single parenthood in Toronto is not a romantic narrative. Childcare costs alone were enough to make me reorganize my entire financial life. I picked up more contract work. I moved to a slightly smaller apartment with a slightly better layout. I learned things about efficiency and time management that I never would have learned otherwise. I built a life that was genuinely, recognizably mine, in a way that my life before had never quite been. Leah, I learned through a mutual acquaintance, had eventually admitted to a friend that the screenshots were not real. The story had a way of traveling. By the time it reached me, it was already secondhand, filtered through 2 people, but the shape of it was consistent. That she had done it because she was convinced I was wrong for Daniel, that she had expected him to recover quickly and move on to someone she approved of, and that she had not anticipated quite how completely it would unravel everything. The police report I'd filed had not gone anywhere formally, but the knowledge of its existence had, apparently, made her nervous for a long time. Daniel had tried to contact me twice in the months after I left. I did not respond to either message. I had nothing to say to him that had not already been said. It was Sophie who told me he was looking for me. She mentioned it carefully, on one of our regular calls, when Ethan was about 18 months old. She said she'd heard through someone at a work thing that Daniel had been asking mutual acquaintances if anyone knew where I was. She said she wasn't going to tell him anything, obviously, but she wanted me to know. I thanked her and I didn't think about it too much. What I didn't know was that Leah had apparently come fully apart by then. The social media work had dried up. The friendship with her brother had corroded under the weight of what she'd done, the truth seeping through eventually the way it always does. His mother had taken her side publicly and lost standing with people on both sides of the family because of it. The infrastructure of lies Leah had built required constant maintenance, and eventually, she hadn't been able to keep up with it. A cousin of Daniel's who had never liked Leah had apparently gotten hold of the original digital forensics report, which my lawyer had shared as part of the divorce proceedings. I don't know exactly how Daniel found out the full picture. I know it happened. I know it took him almost 2 years. I know that by the time he appeared on my porch in the November rain, he had known the truth for several months and had spent that time, according to Sophie, trying to locate me through legitimate means because he understood. By then, that he had no right to simply show up. But he did show up. Because people do. I had moved again by then, to a quieter street in the beach, the kind of neighborhood where people leave little free libraries in front of their houses and wave to each other from driveways. Ethan had just started at the community daycare 2 blocks away. He was 19 months old, mostly walking, completely opinionated about everything, and the absolute center of every morning and evening I had. When I opened the door and saw Daniel standing there, I felt something I had not expected. Not anger, exactly. Not grief either. Something more like the feeling of looking at a scar that has fully healed. It's there. It doesn't hurt anymore in the way it used to. But you don't forget how it happened. He looked terrible. Not in a dramatic way, not hollowed out or visibly broken. Just tired. The particular tiredness of someone who has been living with something for a long time. He said my name. He said he knew he had no right to be there. He said he'd needed to see me. He said he was sorry, that he knew it wasn't enough, that he understood if I never wanted to speak to him again, but he needed to say it to my face. And then Ethan appeared at my hip, grabbing my jeans, looking up at the man on the porch with complete unself-conscious curiosity, the way children look at strangers, with no fear and no agenda. I watched Daniel's face change. He whispered something. I think it was a name, or the beginning of a question, or maybe just a sound, the kind that means your entire understanding of something has shifted in the space of a breath. I stepped back. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway of my house with my son leaning against my leg, looking up at me with his father's eyes and his grandfather's serious expression and the whole complicated ordinary miracle of him, and I breathed. I did not cry. I was done crying over that chapter. I had cried through most of it already, in hotel rooms and furnished rentals and in the car outside the daycare and occasionally in the shower when there was finally a minute to fall apart without anyone watching. I had earned the right to feel nothing but steady. I checked on Ethan, got him set up with his blocks, and I sat down at the kitchen table and I texted my lawyer. Just a heads up that Daniel had made contact. She would want to know. We had an arrangement that protected Ethan's custody status, documents I'd filed when he was 3 months old, and while I had no intention of keeping any father from a child who might someday want to know him, I was also not going to let the terms of that relationship be decided by the person who had spent the first 19 months of my son's life believing a lie. When Ethan was old enough to ask about his father, I would tell him the truth. I had decided this a long time ago. Not my version of it, not the hurt version, just the plain facts. That his father had made choices. That I had made choices. That we were not together. That none of it had anything to do with Ethan, who was wanted and whole and exactly where he was supposed to be. But that was for later. That was a conversation for a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old or whatever age it became necessary, guided by a child therapist I'd already spoken to twice. Not for tonight. Tonight I made dinner. Ethan sat in his high chair and ate most of his pasta and threw some of it on the floor the way he always did, a habit I was choosing not to fight too hard at this particular stage. I cleaned up the kitchen. I read him the book about the bear who couldn't sleep, which we had read approximately 400 times and which still made him point and laugh at the same page every time without fail. I put him to bed. I stood in the hallway of my house, the one I was paying for and keeping and building a life inside, and I listened to the November rain against the windows and the small sounds of my son settling toward sleep. I had not called the police when my husband chose his sister's lie over 4 years of marriage. I had not screamed or begged or performed my innocence for people who had already decided not to believe me. I had done something harder and quieter. I had documented. I had lawyered up. I had left, not because I was driven out, but because I chose to go. I had built something real from the ruins of something that turned out to have been built on sand. And now the man who had stood in my kitchen and let his sister dismantle everything we had without so much as asking a single question was standing in the November rain on my porch, and I had done the only thing that felt honest. I had closed the door. Not in anger. Not in triumph. Just in the plain knowledge that I had earned the right to decide who came through it. Sophie called that night. As she often did after Ethan went to bed. I told her what happened. There was a pause, and then she said, very quietly, "Good." I said I knew. She asked how I felt. I looked around the kitchen, at the crayon drawing Ethan had made at daycare taped to the fridge, at the coffee maker I'd bought myself for my birthday, at the plant on the windowsill that had somehow survived my inconsistent care for going on a 1.5 years. I said I felt fine. I said I felt genuinely, completely fine. And for the first time in a long time, I meant it without reservation.